The sky is angry today.
I have never seen clouds so dark.
They are coming. We have to leave now.
What about the others?
There is no time. Look at the flames! It's spreading too fast!
Is everyone out of the house?
Look to the east.
I see them.
We must hurry.
These symbols are not just drawings. They are the history of our people. They hold the spirits of those who came before us.
The rains are late again this year.
We will manage. We always do.
But the stores are almost empty, Baba.
The village lay nestled between two steep, shadowed hills, quiet and still, as if the land itself were holding its breath. From afar, it looked ordinary. Small homes huddled together, narrow paths worn smooth by generations of footsteps, smoke curling gently from chimneys in the early morning. But to those who had lived there long enough, the calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface of everyday life, an invisible darkness lingered, as constant and heavy as the mist that settled in the valleys at dawn. Misfortune had become ordinary in this village. Death visited often, without warning or mercy. Children were born and lost before their first birthday. Young men, strong and healthy, would disappear in the night, leaving no trace but empty shoes and echoes of footsteps in the forest. Women carried life in their wombs, only to see it stolen by forces no one could name. Fires would ignite in the middle of calm nights, consuming barns and homes while the sky remained clear, as if some unseen hand had struck the match. Madness crept into the minds of those who had once been sane, whispering in corners, making them doubt what was real. Every household had a story of sorrow, every family knew grief before they knew joy. The villagers believed the curse had intention. It did not strike at random. It chose. One family would be spared, only for another to lose everything the following season. A child might live while their siblings fell ill. Elders spoke of the curse as if it were a living thing, one that observed, waited, and decided who would suffer next. Fear, deep and inherited, spread silently through every home. No one felt safe, not even those who appeared strongest, not even those who prayed hardest. Children learned dread before they learned hope. Parents whispered warnings in dark corners. Do not wander too far, do not speak of what you hear at night, do not ask questions you cannot answer. Even laughter became a measured sound, careful not to attract attention. At night, families locked doors and whispered prayers, hoping to keep the invisible watchers at bay. The air carried tension like a rope stretched too tight, ready to snap at the smallest movement. The elders of the village carried the heaviest burden. They met in secrecy, often speaking in whispers so low that only the nearest could hear. Their faces were worn with sleepless nights and eyes hollowed by the weight of unspoken knowledge. When questioned about the curse, they spoke in riddles or diverted the conversation, claiming ignorance. Some things, they would say, are better left alone. But those who looked closely at the elders' expressions, hands trembling, eyes flicking nervously, voices tight, knew that silence was not protection but a trap. Every adult in the village sensed that the elders knew more than they admitted. They had carried the memory of something terrible for generations. They had seen the moment when the darkness was invited, when the village had crossed a line that could never be undone. And yet, bound by oath and fear, they had chosen secrecy over truth. To speak it aloud would awaken the past and perhaps the very curse itself. The village had once been full of life and laughter, but that memory felt distant, like a story from another place and time. Even the land seemed tainted. The soil, fertile in some seasons, bore signs of decay. Trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like fingers. The river, once steady and full, now ran sluggishly at times, and whispers told of strange creatures seen in its waters at dawn. People said the shadows stretched longer than they should, that the wind carried voices when no one else was near. Every day brought reminders that the curse was not gone, that it was present in every hearth, every path, every home. And yet, despite the suffering, a terrible curiosity persisted. Some wondered, in hushed tones, if the curse had a reason, if it was punishment or simply a consequence of something done long ago. The memory of that night, the night when fear and desperation had led the village to make a choice, was buried deep, obscured by layers of silence, but it was not gone. The ritual, forbidden and dark, had invited forces the village could not control. It had promised survival, but survival came at a price no one could fully understand. The children of today inherited the dread of generations before them. They did not know the origin, but they felt it. Dreams were haunted by shadows, laughter often carried a tremor, and the absence of explanation made every strange sound and sudden movement feel like a threat. Families whispered about bad luck or ill omens, but deep down, everyone understood. This darkness was older and wiser than any of them. It waited patiently. It chose carefully. Even as the villagers moved about their days, a quiet unease hung over every action. The curse did not need to strike all at once. It thrived on anticipation, on fear, on silence. It was patient. It was relentless. And it was always watching. In the end, one truth became clear to anyone willing to see it. This was no accident, no random fate. The darkness that haunted the village had been invited, called forth by fear, desperation, and the choices of those long gone. It slept lightly now, but it never truly rested. And the village, bound by secrets and silence, had become its home. The curse never slept. And neither, it seemed, did the memory of what had been done to bring it forth. Long before the curse took hold, the village had been alive with color, laughter, and a quiet sense of harmony. The land stretched wide and generous under the sun. Fields of grain swayed like golden seas, rivers ran clear and full, and trees bore fruit that seemed to hum with life. Children ran barefoot along dirt paths, their laughter echoing across the hills, and elders sat beneath the shade of broad trees, telling stories that connected the past with the present. Life moved with purpose, rhythm, and balance. The village's strength lay not in its buildings or its crops, but in its people. The founding families lived closely, sharing everything from food to stories, from work to wisdom. No one was above another. Each household contributed to the well-being of the whole. Respect for elders was not demanded but earned, built on the wisdom they offered and the love they showed. Decisions were made collectively, often around fires where the children could listen and learn. Every birth, every marriage, every harvest was celebrated with the knowledge that the land, the ancestors, and the people were all connected. Spiritual life was central to the village. The people believed that the ancestors walked beside them, invisible yet attentive. Before planting seeds, they whispered blessings to the soil. Before raising homes, they thanked the earth for its support. Offerings of fruit, water, and small trinkets were left in hidden corners of the forest, believed to sustain the spirit's goodwill. Harmony between humans, spirits, and nature was not a choice. It was a duty, a rhythm that shaped the lives of everyone who called the village home. The seasons brought life, abundance, and comfort. Rain fell on time, filling the rivers and feeding the crops. Illness was rare and passed quickly when it came. Children grew strong, women gave birth safely, and men returned home from the fields each evening with energy in their shoulders and pride in their hearts. Neighbors shared freely, and a sense of trust and community held the village together like invisible threads stronger than any wall. But even in this seemingly perfect harmony, small signs of trouble began to appear. One year the rain came late, leaving the soil cracked and dry. The following year it fell too little, forcing villagers to ration water and abandon some fields. Crops that had once thrived with ease struggled to grow, and the river, a steady lifeline, ran low. For a time, the people believed it was the spirits testing their devotion, a reminder to honor tradition and maintain balance. Then came the whispers of danger from beyond the hills. Neighboring villages had suffered from disease, attacks, or poor harvests. Traders returned with tales of famine, and travelers spoke of unsettled lands where survival was not guaranteed. Anxiety began to creep in, subtle but unrelenting, like shadows stretching across a sunlit room. Fear, though mild at first, grew in the hearts of the villagers. Families began storing extra food, children were kept close at night, and conversations at gatherings carried a quiet tension. Even the elders, who had always been a source of guidance and calm, exchanged glances heavy with worry. The harmony that had once been their greatest strength now seemed fragile, as if a single misstep could unravel it entirely. Despite this growing unease, life still held moments of beauty. Weddings were celebrated with songs and dances that lasted through the night. Festivals of harvest and planting honored both the land and the ancestors. People still laughed, still loved, still hoped. But underlying every joy was a shadow, a small awareness that balance was tipping. Every failed crop, every sick child, every late rainfall reminded the villagers that the world was not always kind, and that the future could not be taken for granted. The early signs of fear planted the seed for desperation. The village, once united by harmony and tradition, began to consider options it would never have imagined before. Hunger, sickness, and the threats from outside had shown them that survival was fragile. The balance they had relied upon for generations was no longer certain. And though they did not yet know it, the choices they would soon make, driven by hope and fear, would invite a darkness that could never be undone. Even in the golden sunlight and fertile fields, an unease lingered like a whisper. The village, so full of life and promise, was standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything. Harmony still existed, but it teetered on the brink. And in the quiet of the hills and forests, the first hints of a shadow stirred, waiting for the moment when desperation would outweigh wisdom. Seasons passed, and the village's hardships only grew heavier. The river, once reliable, had become a thin ribbon of water, barely enough for crops, animals, and drinking. Fields that had once stretched full and golden now yielded meager stalks, brittle and half-formed. The people were hungry, so hungry that stomachs ached constantly, and the sound of children crying became a nightly refrain. Mothers prayed over empty bowls. Fathers returned from the fields with nothing but dust on their hands. Even the strongest men and women grew thin, their faces hollowed by fear and exhaustion. With hunger came sickness. Illnesses that had once been minor became deadly. Children's laughter turned to coughing fits. Elders, once pillars of wisdom and strength, were confined to their beds by fevers that burned too hot to bear. Healers worked tirelessly, mixing herbs, chanting prayers, and burning incense, but nothing seemed to heal the village. Death became familiar. Graves were dug too close together, their mounds rising like reminders that life here was fragile. Fear settled like a stone in the hearts of every villager. Families locked their doors earlier each night, children slept huddled with parents, and even the bravest among them hesitated before venturing outside. The whispers of danger from the neighboring lands now felt too close, too real. Raiders, famine, and disease seemed to be converging on their home, and no ritual, prayer, or offering seemed to protect them. It was during this time that the elders, desperate and weary, gathered in secret. The meeting place was a circle of stones deep in the forest, hidden from the village's sight. Torches burned faintly, smoke curling upward into the night sky, and the faces of the council were pale, lined with worry. They spoke in hushed tones, words carrying both dread and hope. It was the spiritual leader who spoke first, his voice low and trembling. He spoke of an ancient ritual, one that had been outlawed by the ancestors. It was a ritual buried in secrecy because of its cost, a cost that was too high for any ordinary village to pay. Blood, sacrifice, and unbreakable oaths were required. The ritual had promised power, protection, and survival, but those who had tried it before, he warned, had brought destruction upon themselves. Some elders recoiled. They remembered the stories, villages that had vanished, families who had descended into madness, generations wiped out in a single night. They argued fiercely that even in the face of famine and disease, no power was worth that price. But others spoke with urgency. Hunger and death were already claiming the village. Children were growing weak. Families were losing hope. What choice did they have if not to try the only option that promised survival? Fear had pushed reason to the side. Desperation sharpened its claws in their hearts, and even the strongest argument for caution began to falter. The council was divided, and tension filled the air like storm clouds ready to burst. Finally, a plan began to form, not openly but quietly, through whispered suggestions and careful persuasion. The ritual would be performed, but the details were twisted, minimized, or hidden entirely. The villagers were told that it could save them, but not the full truth, that the act they would perform might bind a curse as surely as it could summon protection. Consent, they realized, was fragile and fleeting in a village paralyzed by fear. Parents nodded at the plan, but their minds raced with doubt. Children were shielded from the truth. Those who questioned the decision were silenced with subtle threats or reassurances that sounded too comforting to be entirely true. Everyone believed they were making a choice, but the choice was shaped by terror and hope rather than understanding. On the night of the decision, no one celebrated. There was no joy, no relief, only the heavy, suffocating feeling of inevitability. Mothers clutched their children tightly, fathers spoke words of warning they could not understand themselves, and elders prayed quietly, hoping to protect what little remained. The village was teetering on the edge of an act that could bring salvation, or doom beyond imagination. The first preparations were carried out in silence. Symbols were etched, herbs gathered, and the chosen sacrifice, an innocent whose eyes reflected the fear and confusion of generations, was prepared without knowing the weight of what they would face. The villagers walked carefully, almost ritualistically, toward a fate none could yet fully see. Even as they moved, the darkness of the coming night felt palpable. The winds whispered through the trees, carrying warnings from unseen corners of the forest. Shadows seemed to reach out, stretching toward the villagers, as if the land itself knew the gravity of the choice. Yet there was no turning back. Hunger, disease, and fear had cornered them. The village believed they were choosing life, but in truth, they were stepping into a pact with powers they could not control, inviting a curse that would outlive them all. And in that quiet desperation, the seeds of darkness were sown. The night arrived heavy and silent, like a curtain dropped over the village. Clouds swallowed the moon, leaving the land in near total darkness. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and something older, something alive, unseen yet palpably present. Villagers gathered in the sacred clearing beyond the hills, a place avoided for decades, where moss-covered stones marked the memory of those who had once tried to call the spirits. Torches flickered, casting long, quivering shadows that seemed to sway independently of the people carrying them. Every footstep sounded louder than it should, every creak of wood or rustle of leaves amplified by the heavy silence. At the center of the clearing, symbols of ancient power had been etched into the soil. Strange, jagged lines curved and intersected, forming patterns that no ordinary eye could fully understand. Incense burned at the four corners, its smoke twisting upward in silver spirals, carrying with it a pungent, almost choking scent. The villagers, faces pale and eyes wide with fear, arranged themselves around the circle, each one silently reciting the oaths they had been taught. Even as they spoke, hesitation trembled in their voices. Something was wrong. They could feel it in their bones. The chosen sacrifice, a young and innocent soul, knelt in the center. Their eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the torchlight like pools of liquid fear. They did not fully understand why they were there, only that the village believed their life could save everyone else. The elders assured them it would work, that the spirits would hear and grant protection. Yet no words could soothe the trembling of the heart, the ache in the belly, or the shadows whispering from the corners of the clearing. The ritual began. Words older than the village itself were spoken, their meanings almost lost to time. Oaths were repeated, binding the villagers to silence and obedience. Blood was drawn carefully and poured into the etched symbols on the ground, the metallic scent sharp and overwhelming. Every heartbeat seemed louder in the still night, every movement deliberate and precise. The wind carried voices that no one recognized, soft and hollow, promising power while hinting at doom. At first, the ceremony seemed to proceed as planned. The torches burned steadily, the symbols glowed faintly, and the villagers felt the first shiver of hope. But then hesitation broke the rhythm. One elder faltered in reciting the words, another lied about the order of the steps. The young sacrifice whimpered, sensing the shift, and the silence that had once held the ritual together began to crack. Shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering in the torchlight, and the forest itself seemed to lean closer, watching. A mistake was made, small, almost imperceptible, but enough. A sacred rule, passed down through generations, was broken. The wind rose suddenly, howling through the clearing, scattering the smoke and extinguishing half the torches. The earth trembled slightly beneath their feet, and the whispers of unseen voices turned harsh and urgent. The villagers froze, realizing too late that they had invited something beyond comprehension. The spirits answered. Not the benevolent guardians the village had prayed for, but beings ancient and cold, judging the people for their desperation and their deceit. The shadows in the clearing grew dense, curling and twisting as if alive. The sky above seemed to groan, and the forest exhaled in a voice that was at once everywhere and nowhere. Fear, raw and paralyzing, washed over the villagers. They had not simply asked for help, they had bargained with powers they could not control, and the consequences were immediate. The crucial sacrifice was made. The young one's screams pierced the night, cutting through the chant, the whispers, and the wind. Some elders averted their eyes, others whispered apologies, knowing nothing could undo what had been done. The ritual had succeeded in its intent. The famine would end, the disease would recede, the village would survive, but the price was greater than anyone could comprehend. As the last words of the ritual echoed into the night, a heavy silence fell. The wind stilled, the torches flickered weakly, and the symbols on the ground glowed faintly, almost mournfully. The villagers returned to their homes, carrying with them the knowledge that life had been saved, but something darker had also been awakened. The ritual had traded one kind of suffering for another, far deeper and more insidious. The air in the village was different that night. Even as people lay in their beds, exhausted and relieved, shadows lingered longer than they should, and the wind carried strange whispers through the halls. Something had entered the village that could not leave. The curse had begun. It would not strike immediately, nor would it always be obvious, but it had claimed its place among them, patient, silent, and eternal. The villagers, even in their relief, understood one truth instinctively. The darkness was no longer a distant threat. It was here. It slept lightly, watching, waiting, and it would never forgive what had been done. The price of survival had been paid in innocence and secrecy, and the village, for all its rejoicing, had traded freedom for a shadow that would haunt them for generations. The morning after the ritual, the village awoke to a fragile sense of relief. The river was fuller, the fields showed hints of life, and the sick children seemed slightly stronger. For a moment, the villagers allowed themselves to believe that the ritual had worked, that the suffering of the past months had been lifted, and that their lives could return to normal. Laughter returned to the air, tentative but genuine, and mothers embraced children they had feared would not see the next sunrise. Yet, beneath this fragile hope, subtle signs began to appear. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching unnaturally across walls and paths. At night, soft whispers echoed in empty rooms, voices that carried no words but filled the ears with unease. Dreams became restless. Villagers awoke in cold sweats, sensing unseen eyes in the darkness, feeling presences that moved just beyond the corner of vision. Animals acted strangely, refusing food or fleeing without cause, and the wind itself seemed to carry a warning. The first real tragedy struck quietly. A respected family, known for generations as protectors of the village's traditions, awoke to find one of their own dead in the night. No illness had preceded it. No cause was apparent. The body was still warm, the eyes open in frozen surprise, and the villagers whispered that the curse had begun to choose again. The family's grief was profound, but they dared not speak openly. The elders came quickly, offering ritual words of comfort, insisting that it was a misfortune like any other. Privately, however, their faces betrayed fear, and in the corners of the room, they spoke in hurried whispers about what had been unleashed. Soon, similar events began to unfold across the village. Miscarriages plagued young mothers, leaving families in silent despair. Craftsmen and farmers vanished inexplicably, sometimes for days, sometimes forever. Fires ignited in empty barns or fields at night, leaving charred remnants that no one could explain. Madness crept slowly, infecting minds with paranoia and fear, spreading doubt even among those who had once been strong and wise. The villagers tried to dismiss these occurrences publicly, holding ceremonies and prayers to reassure themselves and their neighbors. Children were told that it was only bad luck, that the forest had spirits that sometimes played tricks, or that illness simply came for reasons humans could not control. But privately, a collective unease took root. Even those who did not witness the strange events themselves felt the weight of what had been done. The elders, who had carried the knowledge of the ritual, watched each incident with a tight-lipped dread, knowing that every tragedy was a confirmation. The curse was real, and it had returned with intent. What unsettled the villagers most was the sense that the curse did not strike randomly. Patterns began to emerge, subtle but undeniable. Families who had been spared for generations suddenly lost a child. Houses that had never burned now smoldered. Those who had once spoken out against the ritual felt eyes upon them in every shadow. The villagers whispered to one another in corners and behind doors. The darkness chooses carefully, balancing the scales of suffering across generations, and it remembered those who had broken oaths or hidden truths. Even the youngest children seemed aware, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke. They woke at night, pointing at shadows no one else could see, and spoke of dreams where fire and whispers merged into one. Adults shushed them, uncomfortable with the knowledge that some part of the curse had already woven itself into the very minds of the next generation. Despite the growing fear, the village carried on, outwardly returning to daily life. Work continued in the fields, meals were prepared, festivals were held, and prayers were offered. But beneath this routine, dread thrived. Every household knew that the relief of survival came at a cost they could not yet measure. The curse, patient and persistent, had begun to shape not only events but hearts and minds. By the end of that first month, it was impossible to ignore the truth. The darkness was not gone. It lingered in whispers, shadows, and dreams, choosing its victims silently, and confirming that the ritual had not simply saved the village, it had bound it to an unending cycle of fear and loss. The villagers understood, deep in their bones, that survival had come at a price far greater than they had imagined, and that the shadows of the night would never leave them unchallenged again. Time moved slowly in the village, but the curse moved slower, patient, and unrelenting. Decade after decade, the shadow of that single night, the ritual, the sacrifice, the darkness awakened, stretched over every home, every path, every life. Families passed down stories of misfortune, whispered in corners to avoid the ears of the young, careful never to name what had truly caused it. Grief became tradition. Fear became inherited. Silence became law. Children were born into a world where sorrow was expected, and joy measured cautiously. They learned to tread lightly, to notice the smallest changes in the air, to read shadows on walls as if they were messages. The laughter of a child was often interrupted by the sight of a neighbor gone missing, or a fire that flared unexpectedly in the middle of night. Even before they could speak of the ritual, they felt its weight. Their dreams were haunted by whispers, their waking hours shadowed by the knowledge that misfortune could strike without reason or warning. Elders became the keepers of secrets, holding knowledge as tightly as they held their grief. They enforced silence through warnings, through fear, and through tradition. Do not ask, they said. Do not question. Families passed these lessons to their children, and the curse became inseparable from the culture of the village itself. The truth of the ritual was no longer a tale told openly, but a ghost in the corners of every home, its memory distorted, mythic, and terrifying. Patterns repeated. Children who had inherited fear without knowing its source grew up to witness the same tragedies their parents had endured. Fires, unexplained illnesses, disappearances, and sudden deaths mirrored the calamities of previous generations. Those who had once questioned the elders' silence learned quickly that questions brought more fear than answers. The curse, patient as ever, seemed to guide these repetitions, balancing loss and survival across families in ways that no one could understand. Parents whispered cautions to their children, often in the middle of the night, shadows flickering across their faces in candlelight. Stay close. Do not wander. The darkness is always watching. Children, obedient and fearful, obeyed, sensing the weight of invisible eyes even when the village appeared calm. Every home was filled with quiet dread, a heavy air that made laughter tentative and sleep uneasy. Even those who did not believe in the curse felt its influence in the way the world bent and shifted around them. The elders themselves grew older, the lines on their faces deepened by decades of worry, guilt, and restraint. Some passed away quietly, leaving only vague warnings to those who survived. Others lived long enough to see grandchildren suffer, the curse moving like a shadow through the generations. None spoke openly, and all felt the weight of responsibility for a secret they had been sworn to guard. Their silence was not cowardice, but a desperate attempt to contain a force too powerful to name. As years became decades, the ritual itself faded from memory. Its details were warped by time, becoming myth and legend, then story, then superstition. Villagers forgot the night of the sacrifice, remembered only that darkness had visited, that lives had been lost, and that caution was survival. Yet the curse remained, patient and unyielding, feeding on the fear and silence that generations had cultivated. The very act of not speaking ensured that the darkness could continue its work. Even families that had once been free from tragedy found themselves drawn into its pattern. Children who should have thrived fell ill inexplicably. Fertile fields failed. Animals disappeared. The curse had become a living force, entwined with every heartbeat of the village, inseparable from their very existence. And all the while, silence was maintained. Questions were whispered and dismissed. Suspicions were hushed and explanations were replaced by warnings. Do not speak of the past. The shadows are patient. The burden of this inheritance weighed heavily on those who survived. Each generation carried the grief of the last, the fear of the present, and the dread of the future. Parents loved their children fiercely, but they did so under the shadow of inevitability, knowing that tragedy might strike regardless of care or devotion. Families were bound by grief, by silence, and by unspoken guilt. The curse, patient and intelligent, had made the village itself complicit in its continuation. By the time the child who would survive against all odds was born, the culture of silence was ingrained. The village had learned to endure, but at a cost. No one could name the source of the sorrow, no one could confront the past, and no one could hope to break the cycle. Fear, grief, and mystery had become inherited traits, shaping lives before they even began. The curse did not merely claim bodies. It claimed the minds and hearts of the villagers, binding them to its shadow generation after generation. And so, the cycle continued. Silence became both shield and prison. The village survived, but it did so under the weight of a secret no one dared speak aloud, a darkness that watched patiently, and a curse that would not rest until it was faced and named. The shadows waited, but the villagers, bound by oath and fear, knew only that something ancient and unforgiving had claimed their lives as much as it had claimed their past. Years passed, and the curse left its mark on every household in the village. Families whispered of it in quiet corners, parents hushed their children at the first sound of a shadow moving outside, and every misfortune was traced back to the darkness that had been awakened generations before. Life continued, but it moved under a veil of fear and quiet resignation. And then a child was born unlike any other, a child the village had not expected to live. From the very beginning, signs marked this child as different. The mother's labor was long and grueling, and the midwives feared the worst. The infant emerged small and frail, eyes wide and aware beyond what seemed possible, a faint tremor running through tiny hands. 4 hours the family waited, whispering prayers to the ancestors, to the spirits, to any power that might grant life. When the child finally drew breath, it was as if the very air had held its breath in relief. The village murmured in awe and fear alike, certain that survival for this child was nothing short of a miracle, or a warning. As the child grew, it became clear that they were not like the others. Sickness that would have felled another seemed to bypass them. Predators that had taken animals and frightened other children left them unharmed. They walked through shadows without fear, watched by the whispers of the curse, yet somehow untouched. Villagers began to murmur that the child was either cursed or chosen, a living embodiment of the darkness that had touched every home. Fear and superstition surrounded the child, even as the parents loved them fiercely and did everything possible to protect them. Isolation became the child's companion. Other children were wary, their parents warning them to stay away from one who might attract the curse. Friends came and went cautiously, hesitant to befriend someone who carried such an invisible weight. Even within the family, the child felt a subtle distance, a quiet worry etched into every glance. The village treated them with reverence and dread, as if the child's survival itself was a sign that the darkness still had plans, still chose who would live and who would die. Despite this, the child grew with a quiet resilience. They learned early that fear could not define them, that survival was more than merely avoiding harm. It was enduring even when the world whispered that they were an omen. Their eyes, dark and searching, seemed to see more than others, noticing patterns and shifts, shadows that danced at the edge of vision. Nights were the hardest. Dreams carried the voices of the past, the whispers of the ritual, the weight of generations of silence. Yet each morning they woke, stronger than the day before, aware that their life had meaning beyond what the village could comprehend. As the years passed, the child became a silent observer of the curse's effects. Families continued to suffer, crops failed in cycles, fires appeared without cause, and madness lingered in certain homes. The child noticed the patterns, the repetitions of grief and loss, and felt a growing sense of responsibility. They could not ignore the shadows. They could not pretend the curse did not exist. The village's survival and suffering intertwined with their own, binding them to a destiny they had neither asked for nor understood. By adolescence, the child's strength and resilience had become apparent. They moved with careful attention, listening to the whispers of the wind, watching the sway of shadows, and feeling the pulse of the land. People came to them in secret, seeking guidance or solace, though many did so with fear. Even the elders, who had always guarded their knowledge and enforced silence, began to see that this child carried a connection to the darkness that was both dangerous and necessary. Loneliness remained their constant companion, but it was tempered by purpose. The child understood that survival was not only about avoiding death, it was about witnessing, understanding, and preparing. The curse had spared them, and in doing so, had placed upon their shoulders a burden that could not be shared, a responsibility that only they could bear. They grew into someone the village would never fully understand, a bridge between the darkness of the past and the hope of a future where truth might finally set them free. Even in the quietest moments, the child felt the presence of something watching, something ancient and patient. But unlike others, they did not tremble in fear. They understood instinctively that they had been chosen not merely to survive, but to confront the curse, to carry the weight of knowledge and courage that the village had long denied itself. In the shadow of despair, they became the light the village would need, even if no one yet realized it. The child who had survived the curse grew into adulthood carrying the weight of the village's suffering. They had always known, instinctively, that the shadows around them were more than mere superstition. Dreams haunted them, vivid and unsettling, filled with whispers, shadows, and flickers of fire that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. At night, they would awaken trembling, heart-pounding, as if the voices of past generations were calling for recognition, demanding that the truth be acknowledged. For years, the villagers had remained silent, unwilling to confront what had been done. The elders enforced their rules carefully, teaching obedience and fear in equal measure, and the adults of the village had learned to pass on the same caution to their children. But the survivor could not remain silent. The patterns were too clear, the repetitions too precise. Every fire, every death, every strange disappearance was a thread in a tapestry of history no one dared unravel. The village was trapped in its own secrecy, and only by uncovering the truth could the cycle be broken. It began with whispers, stories remembered by the oldest villagers, half-forgotten fragments of the past. The survivor sought out the elders, approaching them one by one, hoping to learn what had been hidden. Many refused, shaking their heads, claiming memory had failed them, or that some things were too dangerous to speak aloud. Fear in their eyes betrayed their words, and the survivor realized that these were not mere lies, they were oaths enforced through generations and bound by guilt too heavy to admit. One night, as the survivor wandered near the oldest portion of the forest, they found an elder sitting alone, hunched beneath an ancient tree, staring at the ground. His hands shook and the weight of years had bent his back. He looked up and, for the first time in decades, spoke plainly. He told of the famine, the fear, and the night the ritual had been performed. He confessed the unthinkable. The village had invoked spirits to save themselves, had made sacrifices, and had paid a price far beyond comprehension. He spoke of blood, of oaths, of innocence taken, and of a darkness that had not left. The words fell like stones on the survivor's heart, heavy and undeniable. For the first time the survivor knew the truth. The curse had not been an accident. It had been invited, carefully and deliberately, by ancestors desperate to save their own lives. The cost had been hidden from the village, obscured by lies, omissions, and generations of silence. The darkness that haunted their home was no longer a mystery, it was the consequence of choice, repeated and compounded by fear. The realization was both liberating and crushing. Knowledge had lifted the veil, but with it came anger, grief, and the understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The survivor began to piece together the fragments of history, following clues left in old journals, symbols etched into stones, and whispered warnings from those too afraid to speak. They saw the patterns repeating across time, the deaths, the fires, the madness, and understood that the curse was not merely reactive, it was aware. It responded to secrecy, to fear, and to the refusal to acknowledge the truth. Only by confronting the source, by naming it and facing it directly, could the cycle be broken. But revelation brought resistance. Many villagers, conditioned by generations of silence, feared what might happen if the truth were spoken. Some argued that it was better to live in ignorance, that stirring the past could awaken forces beyond control. Others were angry, believing that the survivor sought to disrupt the fragile balance that had allowed them to endure. The survivor's pursuit of knowledge created rifts in families, divisions in friendships, and tension in the once unified village. Even as they sought the truth, the darkness seemed to sense the challenge, twisting shadows and whispering warnings, testing courage and resolve. Yet the survivor persisted. They could no longer ignore the weight of the past or the suffering that continued silently around them. Dreams guided them, visions illuminated hidden truths, and the whispers of ancestors, once haunting, now felt like guidance. They realized that confronting the curse required not only courage but honesty, acknowledging the mistakes of the past, revealing the sins of those long gone, and demanding accountability from the village as a whole. The path forward became clear. The survivor had to return to the origin, to the site of the ritual, to face the spirits and speak the truth openly for the first time in generations. The curse, patient and relentless, would not release the village lightly. But if it could hear acknowledgement, confession, and courage, there was a chance that the cycle could be broken, that the darkness could be met and contained rather than hidden in silence. With each discovery, the survivor felt both the burden of history and the strength of purpose. They understood that this journey would cost them relationships, trust, and perhaps even safety, but they could no longer allow the village to suffer in quiet ignorance. Knowledge was their weapon and courage their shield. The forbidden truth had been unearthed, and now the true test awaited, the confrontation that would determine the fate of the village, the curse, and their own destiny. The survivors' pursuit of the truth did not come without cost. As the shadow of the curse had shaped the village for generations, so too did fear shape the hearts of its people. Those who had once been allies now hesitated. Some whispered behind their backs, and others openly opposed the survivors' quest. Family ties strained under the weight of revelations long buried, and friendships, once unshakable, began to fray. The pursuit of justice, of truth, and of freedom from the curse was not just a battle against unseen darkness. It became a test of loyalty, love, and courage among the living. The survivor had a companion, someone whose presence had once been a source of comfort, a friend, then a confidant, and eventually, a quiet love that had grown despite the shadows that clung to the village. Together, they had navigated the dangers of growing up under the curse, sharing stories of dreams, visions, and whispered warnings. Yet even love, tender and sustaining, became fragile under the weight of truth. The survivor's determination to confront the past placed the bond under strain. The companion feared the consequences of stirring powers that had long slept, feared the wrath of villagers and spirits alike, and feared losing the survivor to the dangers that awaited at the ritual site. The village itself resisted. Elders who had once enforced silence now found themselves cornered by the survivor's courage. Some admitted what little they could, but others lied, hiding truths that could have helped or hindered. Descendants of those who had orchestrated the original ritual, fearful that history would reveal their ancestors' sins, deliberately misled the survivor, presenting false clues, omitting crucial details, and manipulating the narrative. In doing so, they betrayed the survivor's trust, and the betrayal cut deeper than any shadow or curse could. Heartbreak became inevitable. The survivor discovered that those they had trusted, even loved, had been complicit in hiding the truth, consciously or unconsciously preserving the silence that fed the curse. Each deception, each omission, each carefully spun lie revealed the fragile balance the village had maintained for generations. Fragile, but only because it had been built on fear rather than honesty. The survivor's heart ached for the betrayal, but even deeper was the realization that this pain was part of the cost. Redemption was not free. It demanded confrontation, honesty, and endurance. Amid the betrayals, the survivor pressed on. They confronted families who had hidden truths, demanded answers from those who had avoided responsibility, and faced the villagers' anger and fear. Some rejected the path, afraid of what might awaken, afraid that speaking the truth would summon destruction instead of liberation. Others, however, began to see the clarity the survivor offered, the opportunity to break the cycle of grief, loss, and silence that had ruled their lives for generations. Slowly, alliances formed, fragile yet steadfast, built on courage rather than fear. Love and loyalty, once tested by secrecy and danger, found new depth in the survivor's journey. The companion, after fear had subsided and understanding had grown, chose to walk beside them, facing the peril together. Their bond, forged in shared trials and strengthened by the acknowledgement of truth, became a source of strength. Yet even this love carried risk. The path to redemption demanded sacrifice, and both understood that confronting the curse might exact a personal toll neither could fully anticipate. The survivor also faced internal betrayal, their own doubts, the fear that confronting the past might fail, and the weight of generations of suffering pressing on their shoulders. At times, they questioned whether their efforts were worth it, whether the price of knowledge and redemption was higher than the village itself could bear. But each vision, each whispered warning from the past, reminded them that inaction had cost far more than courage ever could. Through heartbreak, betrayal, and the strain of difficult choices, the survivor learned the most essential truth. Redemption required not only confronting darkness in the world, but in the hearts of those who had endured it. It required honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to accept pain as part of the journey. The curse was not merely a force outside them. It had lived in the fear, lies, and betrayals of the village itself. To end it, the survivor had to face every shadow, external and internal, and accept the cost of truth. By the time the path led them back to the site of the ritual, the survivor had been tempered by grief, strengthened by love, and hardened by betrayal. The village, fractured by fear and suspicion, could only watch as one person prepared to confront the darkness that had shaped their lives for generations. The cost of redemption was clear. It would demand courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to face truths that many had long denied. But for the first time, there was hope that the cycle might finally be broken. The survivor approached the sacred clearing with a mixture of dread and determination, feeling the weight of generations pressing against their chest. The path through the forest was familiar, yet it seemed transformed, older, darker, as if the trees themselves remembered the horrors that had once taken place. Branches twisted above like skeletal hands, shadows stretched unnaturally across the leaf-strewn ground, and every step seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying the survivor's own heartbeat. This was the place where the village had traded survival for damnation, where desperation had birthed the curse that had haunted them all. As they neared the clearing, memories surfaced unbidden. The whispers of the past, dreams that had guided them for years, the faces of those lost to time and fear, all pressed against their consciousness. They remembered the young child taken as the first sacrifice, the trembling elders, the chants that had called forth forces too ancient and powerful to control. The survivor felt both grief and resolve. The grief of the centuries-long suffering, the resolve to finally confront the shadows and break the cycle. The clearing itself was not as it had been described in stories. Moss had overtaken the carved symbols, turning once sharp lines into soft green swirls. Stones, blackened by old fires, jutted unevenly from the earth, as though nature itself had absorbed the darkness and reshaped it. A heavy stillness hung over the place, oppressive but watchful. Even the wind was silent, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the land, the trees, and the shadows knew that this moment was long overdue. The survivor carefully traced the lines etched into the ground, feeling the lingering power beneath their fingers. They could sense the spirits, patient and waiting, their presence filling the clearing with a quiet, oppressive weight. Yet there was no immediate anger, no violent manifestation, only anticipation. The forces invoked generations ago had endured, and now demanded recognition. They did not desire destruction as in the past, they demanded acknowledgement. The survivor understood that survival had never been about blood alone. It had always been about responsibility, truth, and confrontation. As they prepared for the ritual that would reverse the curse, the survivor faced their own fear. Memories of betrayal, loss, and grief rose like waves threatening to pull them under. They remembered the families who had lied, the friends who had doubted, the loved ones who had suffered silently. Yet they drew strength from those very memories, the resilience of their ancestors, the survival of those who had endured against impossible odds, and the quiet courage of their own journey. They realized that this confrontation was as much about human hearts as it was about spirits. The survivor began the rites, speaking aloud the truths that had been hidden for generations. Every word felt heavy, carrying the weight of centuries of fear and secrecy. They acknowledged the mistakes of the past, confessed the sins of those who had performed the original ritual, and revealed the cost of silence and deceit. The clearing seemed to respond. The air trembled, the stones pulsed faintly, and shadows swirled in patterns that reflected the gravity of the confession. Nature itself became a witness to truth, and for the first time, the darkness did not resist acknowledgement. As the ritual progressed, the survivor understood that no more blood was required. The spirits sought recognition, not further sacrifice. The power of the past had been contained not by hiding, but by silence, and it could now be released by courage. The wind rose gently, carrying away the remnants of fear, while the symbols in the clearing glowed faintly, as if absorbing the confession and lending it to the earth. Every shadow seemed to recede slightly, and the oppressive stillness of the forest lifted, replaced by a cautious calm. The survivor stood alone in the clearing, aware that the task was only partially complete, but feeling a shift in the air, a subtle lightness where there had long been weight, a quiet promise that the curse's hold could be weakened. They understood that the path forward would still be difficult, that the village would have to confront its history fully, and that not every shadow could disappear at once. But the first step had been taken. The sacred ground had been faced, the truth spoken aloud, and the spirits acknowledged. For the first time in generations, the survivor felt the stirrings of hope. The darkness that had once dominated the village was still present, patient and watchful, but it had been named, confronted, and understood. The clearing, once a place of terror and loss, now held the possibility of healing. And as the survivor left, they carried with them the knowledge that redemption was possible, even if the cost had been high, and that the village's future would be shaped by courage, truth, and the willingness to face the past. The clearing, once drenched in the fear and sorrow of generations, now felt different under the survivor's steady gaze. The air was thick with expectation, but it no longer carried the oppressive weight of dread alone. The survivor had returned, armed not with weapons or blood, but with truth and courage. They understood that the cycle could not be ended through repetition of the ritual that had cursed the village, but through acknowledgement, confession, and deliberate confrontation with what had been done. They began by speaking aloud the story of the village's past. Every misfortune, every sacrifice, every secret that had been buried beneath layers of silence was named. The wind seemed to listen, the forest bending slightly as if it too waited for this truth. The survivor recounted the night the spirits had been invoked, the child who had been offered in desperation, and the generations that had suffered in silence. Their voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. Every word carried centuries of grief, anger, and hope, and each utterance cracked the invisible chains that had bound the village. The spirits stirred, responding not with the violence of old, but with presence. Shadows shifted and swirled, reflecting the acknowledgement of their power and their grievances. The forest, long a silent witness, now seemed to pulse with life, recognizing that the survivor was neither evading nor denying what had been done. For the first time, the darkness was faced openly, stripped of deceit and silence. This confrontation was not about punishment, it was about balance, about healing, and about lifting the burden that had been forced upon generations of innocence. As the survivor spoke, tears flowed freely, mingling grief for lives lost with relief for the courage to confront what had been hidden. They acknowledged their own fear, the betrayal they had endured, and the loneliness of being chosen by circumstances beyond their control. But in this confession there was also power, the power of honesty, of naming, of refusing to let the past dictate the present any longer. The voices of ancestors seemed to echo faintly, whispers of relief and approval threading through the trees, carrying a message that the curse could be weakened if faced truthfully. The villagers, watching from the edges of the forest, began to understand the significance of what was happening. Those who had doubted, who had feared the awakening of the spirits, saw that this confrontation was not reckless but necessary. Some wept openly, mourning lives lost to silence. Others knelt in reverence, finally acknowledging the truth that had been denied for generations. The survivors' courage was infectious, and slowly the village began to unite, not in fear but in shared acknowledgement of history and the willingness to confront it together. The final step required no further sacrifice. The survivor accepted responsibility not as guilt but as stewardship, a willingness to carry the memory of what had been done, to guide the village toward healing, and to break the patterns that had persisted for centuries. The forest seemed to respond, a gentle wind sweeping through the clearing, scattering the lingering shadows, lifting the heaviness from the earth. The curse, patient and enduring, began to release its grip. Fires burned less often, crops grew steadier, and the air felt lighter, though the scars of history remained. Breaking the cycle did not erase the past. The villagers would always remember the pain, the losses, and the secrets. But naming the truth, acknowledging the consequences, and confronting the spirits openly created a shift. Grief could now coexist with hope, suffering with understanding, and fear with courage. The cycle, once unbroken for centuries, had been disrupted by transparency and bravery. Generations of inherited silence were finally challenged, replaced with acknowledgement, and the first seeds of healing were sown. As the survivor stood alone in the center of the clearing, the wind carrying away the remnants of centuries-old dread, they realized the weight of their role. They had faced betrayal, grief, and the shadows of the past, but in doing so, they had opened a path for the village's future. The curse would not vanish entirely, but its hold would no longer dictate lives in secret. What had been endured in silence could now be confronted openly, giving the villagers a chance to live without unspoken terror shaping every heartbeat. Hope, fragile yet persistent, began to take root. The survivor knew that redemption required vigilance, courage, and truth, but they also understood that it was possible. The spirits, once feared as agents of destruction, now seemed to recognize the honesty of the act, their presence softened, their judgment tempered by acknowledgement. The village, for the first time in centuries, could imagine a life no longer dictated by fear, lies, and secrecy. And in that quiet moment, standing amidst the stones and symbols of the ritual long past, the survivor understood that breaking the cycle was not just about survival, it was about freedom. Freedom from silence, freedom from fear, and freedom from a shadow that had haunted the village for generations. The path to healing had begun, and the darkness, though present, no longer ruled unchallenged. Years passed and the village began to change. The oppressive shadows that had haunted generations gradually loosened their grip, no longer able to thrive on secrecy and fear. Fires became rare, disappearances fewer, and the restless whispers that had filled the night air receded. The land, once heavy with grief, seemed to breathe again, and even the forest that surrounded the village felt lighter, as though the earth itself had been freed from centuries of silent suffering. Children grew up knowing the truth for the first time. Parents spoke openly of the darkness that had shaped their lives, of the ritual that had gone wrong, and of the cost of silence and fear. No longer were misfortune and tragedy shrouded in mystery. They were remembered as lessons, as reminders that choices carried consequences and that courage and honesty could disrupt even the darkest cycles. The village learned that knowledge, though painful, was far more powerful than fear. Families still mourned those lost to the curse, and scars remained in the hearts of those who had endured its grip. But grief was no longer a shadow that demanded silence. It became shared memory, a thread that bound the village together rather than a weight that divided them. The survivor, now recognized as a leader in both courage and wisdom, guided the community in rituals of remembrance, acknowledgement, and healing. The young and old alike participated, speaking truths aloud and honoring both the lives lost and the lessons learned. The village itself transformed. Homes were rebuilt, fields tended with care, and traditions once tainted by fear were restored with intention and clarity. Festivals returned, no longer hollow celebrations of survival, but meaningful gatherings that acknowledged the past while embracing the promise of the future. The air carried laughter again, tentative at first, then more confidently, as if the villagers were learning to trust the light after a lifetime of shadows. The survivors' presence became a beacon. People came to them not just for guidance about the curse, but for wisdom about life, community, and courage. They taught that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. They emphasized the importance of speaking truths that others might avoid, of facing the consequences of past mistakes, and of nurturing hope in the aftermath of grief. In this way, the survivor became more than a person. They became a symbol, a living testament to the power of confronting darkness rather than hiding from it. Yet the village never forgot the cost. Stones still marked the sites of past tragedy, and elders shared stories of what had been endured. Children learned that while the curse no longer claimed lives, history could not be erased. The past remained a teacher, and the lessons of courage, honesty, and vigilance were passed down as carefully as any other tradition. The villagers understood that even as the darkness weakened, unhealed secrets could linger in silence if ignored. The sacred clearing, once a place of terror and despair, was visited often. People walked among the moss-covered stones and symbols, leaving offerings of respect and remembrance. The survivor returned periodically, feeling the gentle pulse of the land and the quiet presence of the spirits. The darkness that had once ruled with fear now existed in balance, acknowledged, respected, and no longer free to dominate through secrecy. The cycle had been broken, not through blood or sacrifice, but through courage, truth, and the willingness to face what had long been denied. As the sun rose over the village one morning, its light spilling across fields that were once barren, it illuminated a community changed but resilient. Children played freely, unburdened by the weight of shadows, while elders watched with cautious relief. Families laughed, celebrated, and rebuilt bonds once strained by fear and betrayal. And at the heart of it all stood the survivor, no longer alone in their knowledge or their burden, guiding the village toward a future where darkness would always be acknowledged, but never again allowed to rule unchallenged. The lesson endured. Unhealed secrets may outlive generations, but truth, courage, and acknowledgement have the power to set a community free. The village had survived not only the curse but the weight of its own silence. And in that survival lay hope, a fragile yet enduring promise that the shadows of the past could teach, but never again enslave.